On Tuesday of this week, the week past, the Presbyterian of Chicago met to meet and then decide on the candidate that was presented to all of us for the executive presbyter position. Gail and Jerry and I drove out to Arlington Heights to meet him and hear him preach and be there in person to vote. His name is the Reverend Dr. Craig Howard, and he was raised right here on the south side of Chicago. We took that as a great sign. One of the questions he was asked by someone in the presbytery is what he can do to help small churches around the presbytery grow. His response was that for far too long, we've been focused on growth and money. Church has become a numbers game for so many, he said. And then he painted a picture where he'd like to get the presbytery to focus on feeding children who are hungry and not counting how many show up to be fed. Gail and Jerry and I clapped loudly. And then he said, what we really need to be focusing on are new worshiping communities. He said some small churches are going to need to die, and that's why we need to be focusing on creating new worshiping communities. Well, I've heard responses like that for most of the past 30 years I've been a pastor. It's simply basic knowledge of the life cycle that he was sharing. Things are born, they grow, then they begin to decline, and eventually they die. And new things are born. I'm sure there were people from some small churches around the presbytery who heard him who might have been a little angry or upset by his response. We want leaders who are going to save churches that are on their way to perishing. What I heard as I sat there listening to him was the correlation between churches and policing. The institution of the church was built on the same Christian supremacy and white supremacy that the United States was built on. So by its very nature, it is systemically racist. We talked last week about how the institution of policing in the United States was built on the very same foundation as were churches. Both center on controlling people's behavior, threatening punishment, and maintaining the wealth and security of white people. But so far, the church has been more willing to enter into conversations about dying in order for something new to live. The conversation about abolishing the police so that something can be born in its place is terrifying for most people, and even more so for some white people. Why? When many people hear the term abolish the police, part of what they envision is that one day we will have all these police, and the very next day we will have no police. That is the stuff of so many dystopian movies, which I don't like, by the way. Like the defund movement, though, the abolish movement is not about having something one day and then nothing the next day. Instead, it's like the small church movement, but intentional, with the gradual decline and death while birthing the new. Many people in the abolish movement think there would probably still be an armed force of some kind, but that it would be very small, specifically used, and given the kind of training that is currently happening in other countries, like 2 years of training instead of 12 weeks of training. There are some people, however, who would like to see the end of any kind of armed police officers. There are some who would advocate for abolishing any and all officers called police who carry guns and who can seemingly do what they want with very little accountability. But even those people would say, we need to help maintain public safety, and we need to find ways to keep peace without using force when large groups gather. If abolishing the police means there's going to be a gradual decline in death, why do some white people get so angry, upset, fearful, and dismissive of the conversation? Let's begin with ourselves. Why do we resist the idea of abolishing the police? What fears do we feel when we enter into that conversation? Why do we sometimes feel angry with those who seem to be pushing the idea and even protesting around the idea? If we're honest, most of us feel fear of some kind. I can't even imagine a world in which we don't have police officers because they've always been a part of the fabric of growing up. I was taught, like many of you, that police were the helpers and they were the ones who could protect our family. I'm not sure I believed it, but I certainly was not taught to fear the police. Some of you were taught that, and for good reason. What are your earliest memories of the police? What stories did your family pass down about the police? These questions are what impact us when it comes to imagining a life, imagining communities without police. Once we've identified what has formed us, we can begin to engage in deeper conversations. I'm open to a conversation about policing and the institution of policing coming to a close while something new is born, and I'm open to it in part because of my personal experience. Not every white person has experienced the police as helpful or protective. At the same time, very few white people have been abused and or killed by the police, especially compared to Black and brown people. I'm also open to abolishing the police because I believe every story I have ever heard from Black, Indigenous, and people of color about the police. Let's go beyond ourselves and our own experiences and look at the story that Jerry read in the Gospel of Mark today. There's a major thread that runs through all those little snippets, and the thread is this: just because something is the law or the tradition or the expectation doesn't mean it's good or even the best option for that person or community. It starts off with people asking Jesus why his disciples don't fast when the disciples of John were fasting. The question itself is instructive. If this thing is good for these two groups of people, isn't it also what you should be doing? Jesus responds by saying, in essence, no. It's not good for my disciples as long as they are with me. The issue of the wedding makes it confusing, but I think part of what's being said about the wedding is fasting and celebrating don't go together. And so if you are celebrating, fasting is not what is going to be best for you. I've also sometimes wondered, though, if this story involving Jesus and his followers not fasting was also because they might not have been eating 3 meals a day, and they were constantly on the move and serving people. And so it's possible Jesus was protecting his disciples by saying, they can't be fasting right now. I wonder, that's just a theory. Jesus then does a teaching on new cloth going on an old cloak and new wine going into old wineskins. The gist of this teaching is that it doesn't work to join an old paradigm with a new teaching or a new paradigm. It doesn't work to take an old law and just try to give it some new understanding. If you have a system that is racist throughout, trying to impose or create a new measure that talks about one or a few different behaviors is not enough. It's not going to work. It's new wine in old wineskins, and that old wineskin will burst. The final story in this section of teaching by Jesus is the one about whether or not it's lawful for Jesus' followers to pluck grain on the Sabbath. The Pharisees tried to make the case that they were violating the law on the Sabbath, which was that no one could do work of any kind. Jesus' response was basically to say, what's more important? That someone rests on the Sabbath and does no work, or that someone eats? Jesus makes the case that the law was supposed to benefit humankind. So if the keeping of that law actually harms humankind, in this case even prevents them from eating, then that's not the spirit of the law. Humankind is the important part of the equation. Laws are not simply objective things, whether religious or civic. So are we beginning to make the connections to policing? What laws have been made over time? Who has been enforcing them? And who do they benefit in the end? The Abolish movement is saying something like Jesus said about the Sabbath, about why Jesus' followers don't need to fast, and about new wine in old wineskins. Let's take the idea of new wine in old wineskins and flesh it out a little. As we heard last week, policing in this country started as slave patrols designed to catch black people running away from their owners. White lives and white people's property were prioritized over all else. That's the old wineskin, the wineskin that is still in use today. When people talk about police reform and how police need to be accountable and police need better training and police need to be more involved in the communities they're policing and police need mental health care, isn't that in some ways like trying to put new wine into those old wineskins? What the Abolish movement is saying in part is that we need to create the new wineskins that are going to hold the new wine. This is not a task that happens overnight. In the article I read from last week in the New York Times titled, "Yes, we mean literally abolish the police," Mariam Kaba says, but don't get me wrong, we are not abandoning communities to violence. We don't want to just close police departments. We want to make them obsolete. We should redirect the billions that now go to police departments toward providing healthcare, housing, education, and good jobs. If we did this, there would be less need for the police in the first place. So how do we create communities that are less violent, that have accountability coming from many places, and that have respect and care as deep values. Policing has led to a serious disinvestment in neighborhoods in order to invest in more policing over the years, which is why we have such bloated police budgets, including the $1.9 billion police budget here in Chicago. Policing has led to mass incarceration, supposedly in order to uphold civic laws, but as anyone who reads knows, it was actually police violating laws, torturing confessions out of people, rushing to close cases, not caring if someone's identity was mistaken or not. John O'Donnell sent me some thoughts about my sermon last week, and I appreciated hearing his perspective. One thing he said was this: one simple truth we can all agree to: 2.3 million people incarcerated in the U.S. is far too many. That is a far higher rate than almost any other country. We can argue about how to fix that, but we can all agree it must be fixed. We want to be the land of the free, not the country of mass incarceration. Amen to that. Thanks, John. Policing has led to generational trauma in the Black community as generations have witnessed mistreatment, abuse, violence, and murder, all at the hands of the police. Policing has led to generations of young Black men and women being incarcerated, many for things that white people would never be arrested for. Several years ago, while I was working on a project with the Public Defender's Office, I became aware of how unjust our justice system was. Firsthand, I had read about it, but I saw it in action. I witnessed the bail hearings for those who had been arrested. Those who were poor and could not afford bail were held in jail until their case came up in court, which could be years for some. They had not yet been proven guilty, but spent 1 to 3 years incarcerated anyway. They couldn't help support the families, so often the family would lose their house or apartment and then have to rely on relatives. Many of them were found not guilty in the end after having spent 1 to 3 years in prison. And we call that democracy. Yesterday afternoon, we held our 6th annual vigil against violence. We heard from 6 different speakers, each of whom advocated for and challenged us on the issue of abolishing the police. Some of them didn't even use those terms, but it's what we heard. I want to highlight one thing from each speaker. Cosette Ayele started us off by giving some statistics about how ineffective the police are at solving or preventing crimes. One statistic she gave was that 4 out of 10 crimes get solved in Chicago. When the victim is Black or brown, that number is reduced to 0.2. And yet the police budget continues to increase and is now at an all-time high. Reverend Sierra Bates Chamberlain followed Cosette, and Sierra had us chant, "I am a peacemaker." She was connecting being peacemakers to insisting on a moral budget, and a moral budget includes decreasing funding for the police so that we can increase funding in neighborhoods. She charged each of us with calling our alderpeople to ask them to vote for the budget amendment that has been introduced in City Council. Cheryl Hamilton Hill told us stories about many people who are experiencing mental health crises and how they end up being mistreated or killed by the police. She challenged us to learn more about mental illness and how to be with people who are experiencing crises rather than calling the police on them. Arturo Carrillo told us some truth. The city of Chicago employs 20 full-time social workers who are paid $40,000 a year, while the city employs 14,000 police officers who are paid $72,000 a year. 72 is just the entry-level pay. He charged us with supporting the Treatment Not Trauma campaign and by supporting the budget amendment, which would shift money to support more social workers. Amika Tendahi told us about how she and her organization trained more than 2,000 people to provide first aid on the streets, because when shootings happen, police are often the first on the scene and they will not provide first aid, despite a number of them being trained. Ambulance response time, particularly on the south and west sides, can sometimes be more than 30 minutes. And until recently, there was no level 1 trauma center on the south side. Reverend Smash reminded us that we take care of us. And by that, she meant that we get empowered as communities to take care of one another in all ways. What they were all saying in various ways was that as people of faith, as community members, we need to work hard to get a moral budget passed, to decrease reliance on police by empowering community members to know how to take care of each other, and to create new visions for not only public safety, but for what communities of care could look like. We heard nothing less than God's vision for our city and our world yesterday through the voices of those prophets. Amen.